Up next, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nishan de Mel, the Executive Director of Verite Research.
Thank you. Nadishani Pereira, the head of Transparency International Sri Lanka, which has been the organization that has been at the heart of steering the process of producing this governance diagnostic. Fellow members of the core group of organizations that has been contributing enormously to steering and guiding the content in the report. Of course, that includes Professor Arjuna Parakrama, diligent members of the media who are here with us, and honored guests and friends. Thank you for your interest today in being part of what I think is a globally unprecedented action where civil society organizations across a nation have gotten together and said, in the midst of a debt and economic crisis, we want to pioneer and suggest, not just talking about the problem, but about the solutions that have to come from governance and government. I don't think that has happened before. So Sri Lankan civil society really has, I think in this case, distinguished itself. And this is not, as you can see from what Professor Parakrama shared, a litany of complaints or a list of problems. This is an impressive analysis and list of how concretely you can sustainably solve the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. The IMF has, for the first time, admitted, and the first time in Asia, said that the economic problems of Sri Lanka are not just rooted in the economic aspects of the country, but are rooted in the governance aspects of the country, and asked the government to produce a governance diagnostic. But, you know, there's a Sinhala kind of a phrase that says, "Horage ammagen pena hanawa wage." How do you ask the culprit to tell you, or the culprit's colleague to tell you how to find the culprit or how to solve the crime? So you don't ask the culprit how to solve the crime, and that's what the Sinhala phrase says. And I think a process led by the IMF and other organizations inevitably run into that problem because they deal with the government. So they needed very much, I think, this initiative, which they have actually welcomed, that the civil society and the country must get up and speak about it. I'm going to ask two questions before I end my 5 minutes, one from the people of Sri Lanka and one from the IMF. But let me start this way. At the heart of what we called democracy is the idea that the political leaders who make decisions represent the people. And yet, people tend not to be too concerned about how decisions are being made when they don't understand how it impacts them. So colonizers that simply focused on extracting resources tended to be able to maintain colonial power for a very long time, but when they started taxing, their power got destabilized. And the famous phrase, no taxation without representation, was when people felt the pain of the decisions that are made, they become more alive to the problem of non-representation, and taxes are one way in which that happens. Arjuna started by talking about the Aragalaya, or the protests, the unprecedented protests in Sri Lanka, and talked about system change, that people asked for system change. What is the change in the system that they wanted? And I want to suggest that the heart of the call for system change is for the political and decision-making leadership, and it's not just political, also bureaucratic, to be accountable to the people for what it was doing. Now I know, so here's my question to the people of Sri Lanka and civil society. I know that many of you and us or others go around saying, protesting the taxation and asking for the taxes to be reduced. And here's the question, shall we ask for lower taxes or shall we ask for greater accountability on how those taxes are imposed and how they are spent? It is these taxes, I want to say, just like in that phrase, of no taxation without representation, that has, in a sense, woken up a society that was dulled to the abuse of power and bad decision-making because we reduced, the governments that did it the most reduced taxes the most. They simply borrowed unsustainably and people thought we are all right. It's okay, it's working because we don't feel the pain, we just feel the benefits. But of course, as it comes home to roost, these are not sustainable ways of functioning and running an economy. You can't keep borrowing and spending. And today we are paying the price for that negligence, for that inattention, for that lack of interest in what government was doing. So we have a chance today with this governance diagnostic to rally around, and notice this is not saying reduce taxes. It is saying be more transparent about who you're taxing, what you're taxing, how you're spending it, and be more accountable. Accountability is the one word that is at the heart of this diagnostic, not accountability to human rights commissions abroad, but accountability to the people of Sri Lanka for how the economy is governed. And that's a very difficult thing we shouldn't put this problem at the feet of the IMF. The IMF as a, international bureaucracy is accountable ultimately to the government of Sri Lanka, and hopes that the government is accountable to the people. But if the government that they are accountable to are not accountable to the people, the IMF has a problem being accountable to the people of Sri Lanka, despite the best intentions of their staff who would really like to do certain things in a way that is more accountable to people. The organizational constraints make them actually a lot more accountable to government, and you will see that in the governance diagnostic that the IMF publishes, it'll be great to do a gap analysis. And what is here, because this is clearly the will of the people in Sri Lanka emerging, but is not there, might be just the things that the government didn't want to see, or especially did not want to see, which the IMF has no ability to prevent from being omitted from their own governance diagnostic. The IMF also, because we are on the 17th program, it suggests that either the patient is misbehaving very badly or the hospital itself is perhaps not providing sustainable remedies. So when you get to the 17th program and 50% of Sri Lanka's, 50% of the years since 1966, Sri Lanka has been in the IMF program, 28 years in 56 years, we have to ask what is it that the IMF tends to miss. They traditionally, understood that they must emphasize increase in revenue, but they didn't emphasize very much how you increase revenue, right? So it's important to say how much you raise, but how do you raise it? Who gets tax holidays? Whose taxes are not collected? And Sri Lanka has traditionally moved to a system where we respond to IMF programs by increasing the burden of consumption taxes and still going on with status quo, and in fact increasing tax holidays at the top and non-collection of taxes at the top while the bottom feels the pain. It is not simply about how much you should cut spending, but where you cut spending. The governance diagnostic shows that under IMF program pressures, the government cut agricultural spending the most, or a great deal. Rather than wasteful spending, say, on assets like vehicles that are bought willy-nilly, even without an asset registration, asset management system being maintained for it. So I think we understand that governance has been the heart of Sri Lanka's economic problem, and the IMF has also I think, understood it, and that's a very important shift that they have made. And in a way, the IMF has had the ability now to hold accountable a government that the people of Sri Lanka are struggling to hold accountable. And they have put very important clauses even in the program that is currently running. And it's surprising that while the government is implementing quite a lot of the actions that the IMF has asked, the actions that they are most prone to not implementing are the ones related to governance. And in fact, they are flouting the spirit of improved governance in the way they are implementing some of these actions. And I want to go into details, but I'll just end by reminding you of one governance action that the IMF has asked. They have asked for and that's mentioned in this, a fiscal transparency platform that does three things. That it should make transparent all significant public procurement contracts. It should make transparent a list of firms receiving tax exemptions. And it should make transparent a list of individuals as well as companies getting tax-exempt luxury vehicles. Remember, the staff level agreement was in place last September. It was negotiated even before that. The government has had over a year to do this. And yet, it remains undone. The IMF is about to start the review to release the second tranche. And it has, now the question, an extremely important decision to make. Do we really hold the government accountable to implementing these kinds of governance commitments? Or do we, with a nod and a wink and a shrug, perhaps say, oh, it's okay? The risk that the IMF takes is it risks losing credibility in terms of its own commitment and evaluation that governance is at the heart of the problem. And it risks giving government the signal that they can continue to get away by not taking governance seriously. So the question is to the IMF at that point. People of Sri Lanka are asking, but are unable now to get accountability from their government. The IMF is well placed and positioned. Will it make its governance, the commitments, will it treat them as being serious commitments or ones to be overlooked? Which creates an enormous moral hazard. So I think we all have important decisions to make. The people of Sri Lanka must ask whether we campaign and ask for lower taxes or greater accountability. The IMF must ask whether it will take its own governance commitments in the program, treat them seriously. And I think if we work together, we may still have a chance for the system change that we are all seeking. Thank you very much.